All right, everybody. 1920s and 30s. We're looking at the world between the wars, chapter 29. Page 686 in your textbook. Please notice that I'm using the online version. This is something you can use anytime, all the time. These can be your category headings, your section headings. You've got the Roaring Twenties. We see Revolution, the Global Great Depression, the Authoritarian Response. And we have some of these extra reading documents that you might find useful as you read through. So I'm going to do things a little differently. What I'm going to start with is some curriculum questions. The AP World History test is set up by something called Key Concepts. And you might notice in the background I've got some nice 1920s style music going on. It's something I enjoy. You might look into it. Some fun music. So, we got a couple of questions here that you might look for. Really what we want to see, the big concept in this chapter, and really for this part of the 20th century, is we got a couple of concepts. Economic growth, economic collapse, war and power, like authoritarian power. And then we also see government action or inaction. So, a couple of questions I've highlighted here that you might want to look for. What circumstances contributed to genocide and mass refugee populations? And look at these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm not going to give you the clean this time around. I anticipate you guys are scholars, so you can pause as you need, and you can write stuff down or take notes as you wish. But this question here, how did the world wars affect the nature of war and the relationship of government to their populations? We just saw World War II, so we're going to work our way back to World War I now. But in between the two wars, we see governments create programs before the wars to try to deal with economic problems, but then also during the war to help out in the war effort. That was something we saw called total war. And something that motivates the wars are communism, capitalism, and then this, the racial and cultural superiority. But we're also going to see, again, economic growth, economic collapse. A little bit further, and we get into key concept 6.3, is new conceptualizations of global economy, society, and culture. So as a result of some of these global conflicts, we've already seen the United Nations, the League of Nations come along. But League of Nations is really where we're going to get to with this chapter, with the next war that we see with World War I. It fails. United Nations comes in after World War II. We also see the New Deal, a government program, government institution, because of the Great Depression. The reason these new institutions come along is because there's wars. People don't want war. People don't want economic uncertainty. Remember, we always want the 3 S's, safety, security, and stability. So we seek those in any way we can find them, and that's what makes these institutions possible. So what you're going to need to be able to do is, in between the wars, World War I and World War II, what were the major political and economic factors that shaped society? What significant events changed the world? So take notes on these, and you'll see that we've got some social stuff, scientific, intellectual, artistic, like Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Pablo Picasso. You guys already saw Guernica with the extra credit quiz we did. Then fascism. The rise of fascism is something that we see here. We've already seen what happens with fascism when Hitler comes to power. But why did he come to power? How come people would let this genocidal dictator in power in Germany and start a war for him? Remember, Germans didn't think they were the bad guys. They had a totally different perspective on the war than what the outside world did. And actually, I have an article we'll be reading later on about what did Germans think about what was going on in Europe. So make some notes on these. Pause as you need. And then we've got some focus questions here. These are the actual key concepts from the College Board. These are what the College Board says you need to know, and they're going to make the AP exam based on these. So this is something I thought I'd do differently. This is what's guiding me as I plan what we do, what we cover, what I talk about, and so on. So what we see is World War II, Chapter 30, it was the end of the European order. But at the beginning of it, in the beginning of the 20th century, Europe dominated the global world. But they started losing some power. We also see some empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Qing Empire. They collapse in this chapter because of World War I, because of a revolution, because of internal conflict. So these are some interesting questions you might want to make sure you write down or consider for yourself. So I'm going to keep going through here. These are some other key concepts. We see transnational movements like communism trying to unite people. Communism spread first throughout Russia, but then it starts getting picked up in Asia. We see some people in Latin America trying to make it happen. We've already seen this in one of those, the chapter on Latin America. And then movements to redistribute land, especially in Latin America, and this chapter is what we're going to be looking at. And then military conflicts, total war. We've already talked about this. So pause this, read through this. You don't have to write all this highlighted stuff down, but just notice this. If it's something that you know comes from chapter 29 or it looks familiar from chapter 29, it's good for you to know. So pause, I'll wait. I guess I will say cling clang. All right, so now we're in chapter 29. We got a couple of patterns that start in this chapter because of World War I. First, Europe didn't recover from the war. Second, because of World War I, the United States and Japan rise as industrial powerhouses, but the United States, this is really where we become a superpower after World War I. And then lastly, there's a lot of revolutions that we see, like major stuff that we've seen echoing out throughout all the chapters we've covered so far. Mexico, we've seen what happens in Russia with the Kuomintang and Mao Zedong, and then now we're going to see the Russian Revolution. So the music in the background you can hear, hopefully it's not too annoying, is the Roaring Twenties. That's the Roaring Twenties. It was a good time. It was a time of prosperity and new outlooks on the future. And you can see that changes in society and changes on outlooks in society created new opportunities and had a lot of new changes, but there's also some struggles for continuities, and it was a struggle for trying to find the right balance. So Germany looked like it was going to bounce back in the 20s because they have a new democratic government, and then there's a new treaty, essentially, that the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which basically outlawed war. Obviously that didn't work because World War II happened. And generally in the 20s, as nations are recovering from World War I and rebuilding their economies, it looks like life is going to be good. So I'm not going to go through this all word for word. You can read, you can pause. I'm just going to say cling clang right now, and you can pause whenever you want to. A big change that we do see in this social aspect is women who went to work in the factories during the war lost some of that economic freedom, but then they start pushing for more voting rights and social freedoms in a lot of countries. So that's a big change that we see beginning in the 20s that, as you guys know, we've seen it echo down throughout the decades. And then we've seen the term settler societies already, settler societies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. This is where they really start to have some more flexibility. They're starting to kind of flex their independence muscles. But then fascism. This is a big thing that we see happening in the 20s and 30s. Fascism starts in Italy with Benito Mussolini, which comes from the Latin word like a bundle of sticks, like to bundle together. So you have all the people that are bundled together by one strong leader. He really streamlines it. He was actually, as I already told you in World War II, he was kind of the model that Hitler wanted to try to follow. So as fascism starts to rise, it offers easy solutions and strong national unity, so therefore a lot of nationalism. And we see it starting to take hold. A lot of times you have authoritarian governments in, like Eastern Europe, for instance, that are struggling throughout the 20s either to rebuild from the war or to deal with the new changes in society and in the economy. But some places we see revolutions. Outside of Europe, like in Mexico, we see people pushing for more reform, for more rights, for more economic freedoms. And so in Mexico, it calls for political and land reform, education, nationalism. This caused the Mexican Revolution. And this is where we see the names. We've already seen the Zapatistas that we saw in a previous chapter. Pancho Villa, a lot of you already know about. Victoriano Huerta. They're looking for to consolidate power for themselves, but it eventually ends up with Obregón, who takes power. And then what we see, interestingly, as we've already seen before, the PRI, that political party we saw way back in the chapter on Africa, Latin America, and Asia, the PRI is where they take power. This is why Mexico had some of those troubles and struggles and successes that we saw previously. Now, Russia is a really cool study as well. If you've ever seen the movie Anastasia, the animated movie about the girl who was the Tsarina, or the princess, that's this whole story, the revolution in Russia. The Tsar abdicated, and this is TSAR. You'll also see CZAR. Tsar basically being like Caesar, like the emperor. He gave up the throne, and it was actually executed by the Bolsheviks. And they were led by this guy, Vladimir Lenin, who got Russia out of the war in World War I and tried to create some kind of new political system without a czar, without an emperor. He did this new economic policy, which was trying to mix communism and capitalism, trying to fix the economy that was devastated by World War I. But as we see, the Soviet Union was very much authoritarian. They called themselves a republic, which is like a people's form of government, but it was not. You could vote for one candidate. That's not really a republic. So they in the Soviet Union, they're encouraging organization of workers and different social groups, and they're providing education. But then when Lenin dies, there's a power struggle, and Joseph Stalin, again, the name we've seen before, you guys made a drawing of him. Joseph Stalin was very much about Russian communism and about communism spreading locally by state and supporting communism around the world. So anybody that opposed him were exiled, sent to work camps, or just murdered outright. Then we see this happening in Russia, in China as well. So we see a communist revolution in Russia. We see a political and economic revolution in Mexico. China has a revolution because the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China, collapses with internal problems. And Sun Yat-sen is not a name that we've seen yet, but we have seen one of his associates, or spiritual associates anyway, Chiang Kai-shek. We've already seen this. They start this nationalist party that we've seen as the Kuomintang. They're promising reforms. They're focusing on trying to get China caught up to the outside world and so on. They're receiving aid from all over the place. But then Mao Zedong is dedicated to the peasants, and Chiang Kai-shek was against the communists because he was getting our support in the West. And remember, this is part of the reason Japan and us had some struggles before World War II, because we were supporting we gave our approval to the Chinese government, which Japan was Japan was fighting against. So this is where we see the rise of Mao and the Communist Party struggling against the nationalists. We've already seen what happens with that. Mao Zedong takes over, and the Communist Party starts, the People's Republic. Then we have the Great Depression. What happens is there's a lot of different problems. World War I had such a drain on economies. There's a lot of overproduction, which causes prices to fall, and therefore people aren't making as much money. And when you don't make as much money, you can't pay your bills. When you can't pay your bills, the bank wants the money that you are owed, or that they are owed. So if you can't pay it, they just take your house, or they take your farm, or they take your car, or whatever, as the case may be, the business. And this is exacerbated, made worse, by governments not providing a lot of guidance. And even a lot of times they would react in the wrong way and start raising tariffs. They're like, oh no, our economy's bad. Well, let's raise our tariffs so that people have to pay more to sell their goods in our country. So, in other words, we want people to buy American products, so we raise tariffs on anybody else's products, which means those other countries will raise their tariffs, and they're not going to buy American products, so we're just hurting each other. And so we start to see employment decline. Then in October 1929, the New York stock market crashed. And this is where people had their entire life savings, their businesses, everything wiped out in a day, pretty much. And so over the next couple of years, we just went lower and lower and lower, so that in some places in the United States and around the world, unemployment reached 25%, 50%. It was terrible. It was socially and politically upsetting because governments weren't responding properly. We see a lot of the artwork changing. This is where art reflects society sometimes. And then people are clamoring for their governments, do something. We don't have anything. We're homeless. We're jobless. We don't have any food. We need something. Now, Stalin was trying to industrialize the Soviet Union because they were so tightly controlling the economy and society in the Soviet Union. It wasn't actually hit as hard as the rest of the world. In Japan, it caused a political crisis. We've seen what happens there. We see this military, not really dictatorship, but military authority taking power in Japan. Western governments, as it points out, raised tariffs on imports. They cut government spending. But what happens is you start having arguing parties that are saying, we'll fix it this way. Oh, no, we'll fix it that way. Something we did in the United States, instead of turning to fascism, we turned to President Roosevelt, who promised the New Deal. Major thing. You're going to learn a lot more about it in U.S. history. But for our sake, what we see is it was direct government intervention in the economy. Americans were being paid directly, getting money directly from the government to do work for the government. So we see a lot, it's called alphabet soup. We see a lot of these different organizations or government programs popping up, CCC, NWA, all these different things. And it plans the economy a little bit more, and the banks are regulated more heavily, and it slowly restores not just confidence in the economy, but confidence in the government that something can and is being done. In Europe, though, we see a kind of an opposite response. It's not just controlling the economy, it's controlling of society. Fascism spreads from Italy into Nazism in Germany. We see Latin America having these authoritarian regimes popping up. Military authority wins out in Japan. Soviet Union, Stalin really cracks down. And then we have Nazism. We've already talked about this. He created a totalitarian state. Clang, clang. Write all that stuff down. Next, the Spanish Civil War is important because the Spanish were a friend to the Nazis, which helped them a great deal in World War II. Latin America, we've seen some of these before, like down here. Go ahead and write all this stuff down as you need to. Basically, the Great Depression facilitates reform movements throughout Latin America. Then we've seen this before. Argentina, Juan Perón. We've seen his name before. You should recognize that. Now, Japan recovers faster than the West because military rule takes over. But this is where we start to see the problems, maybe even we can say the beginning of World War II, because Japan invades China and starts to try to take more territory, Manchuria, Korea, Taiwan, and so on. They're industrialized and they're self-sufficient. So, clang, clang. basically, this is setting the stage. This is why World War II happens. We've got a lot of uncertainty. We've got a lot of authoritarian regimes. We've got a lot of nationalism just waiting to strike a match.